Join me today as we talk with Mark Anderson about interviewing for Fraud Matters. FraudCast. Hello, fellow fraud fighters. I'm your host, Alexis C for FraudCast. Today we're talking with Mark Anderson of Anderson Investigative Associates about interviews and interrogations in the fraud environment. Hello, Mark.
Hi, how are you doing?
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you
Good.
for joining us today.
It's good to be here. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure, absolutely. I've been doing this a long time. I actually have 2 degrees in chemistry. I'm a forensic chemist by training, and didn't stay in the lab very long because I found out that those people were very weird, and they were a different weird than I was. So I used that background to get into the FBI and worked for the FBI for several years before doing everything there, reactive crimes, drug matters, foreign counterintelligence, terrorism. And I used that to get over into went to work for the State Inspector General up in New York State as a Deputy Inspector General. And that's kind of my first access into the fraud world and working fraud investigations. Worked for them for several years and then went back to the federal side. Worked for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Office of Investigations, doing investigations in nuclear power plants, hospitals, any facilities that had regulated nuclear products. And then went from there to the Department of Justice, where I started working for the Office of the Inspector General for Justice. Had the opportunity to work in a one-man office working out of my home up in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. Fantastic gig. It's always good when you are about 4 hours away from your bosses. And worked there for a while, planned to retire from there, and ended up going down to the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center down in Glencoe, Georgia, for a course, and was recruited to come down there and teach. And I went to work in the Behavioral Science Division, teaching interview and interrogation matters. I've been teaching as an adjunct for about 10 years at a couple of colleges up in Pennsylvania. Really enjoyed the teaching aspect, and so when this opportunity came up, it seemed like a natural fit. So we moved down to Georgia, and I started working there. Worked for FLETC for several years, and then was recruited to come over and work for the Inspector General Criminal Investigator Academy, and took over their advanced and basic interview programs, where we were deployed nationwide to teach Inspector General employees, auditors, investigators, inspectors, advanced courses in interview and interrogation. Did that. I was in a law enforcement position, so hit that mandatory age where they were kicking me out the door, and wasn't ready to stop teaching. So my wife and I started a business, which is the Anderson Investigative Associates. And now what I do is go around the country training anyone with needs in the area of interview and interrogation matters, as well as investigative matters, investigative planning, and things like that. Hey, I hope that wasn't too long, but as you get older, man, that resume gets longer and longer.
Well, thank you so much. I think that's outstanding. I think one of the things that comes to mind as you were talking about that is that a question that I often get is, well, what is the difference between an interview and an interrogation? And so what is your take on that?
I get that question all the time. It's interesting. When I got to work at FLETC back in 2009, we were not even using the term they weren't using the term interrogation at all, because it had gotten such a bad rap. It kind of goes along with the concept of waterboarding, or hitting people with rubber hoses and phone books and stuff like that.
Sure.
And I'm not sure why it got that bad rap. I think it was the way it was, put out there to the public, the way some things were explained. But the way I explain it, and I explain it this way all the time, I get that question much more from the auditor and inspector side than I do the investigator side. But the way I explain that is that there isn't a whole lot of difference. The interview is a fact-gathering sort of interview where you're going in to get details of what might have happened, to get verification on certain paperwork or documents or evidence that you might have. Whereas the interrogation is that opportunity you have when you're talking to someone and they're providing you information that is contrary to the information that you have in your evidence, and you're trying to get clarification on that. So you're confronting them with information that may be different from that they're providing. And, auditors say, well, I never do an interrogation. And the fact is, auditors do interrogations when they are trying to ascertain whether their audit findings are consistent with what the person is saying. There's an interview instructor who actually uses the illustration of the difference between an interview and an interrogation is you have two seats. You have the willing seat and you have the unwilling seat. And what you have in an interrogation is you're attempting to move that person you're talking to from the unwilling chair to the willing chair. And that's really the difference to me between an interrogation and an interview. The interview, you have a person that's there and they're willing to provide you the information. In the case of the interrogation, you have to do some work to move them to a position where they'll tell you the truth.
I think that's an excellent explanation. I know that myself, when I was in-house, I ran across that management had just huge heartburn around that word interrogation, especially since some of the countries that we were working in were that term just had a terrible negative connotation to it. So we had to change the policies and procedures to just change that word to a forensic interview, because frankly I couldn't think of a better word to call it than that, even though the process is exactly the same. There's no difference in the process.
It's interesting where sometimes I think we create the whole dilemma of that by having engaged in bad practices, and then those bad practices are magnified, and then all of a sudden the word becomes bad when in fact there's nothing wrong with the word at all or the technique if it's applied appropriately.
I absolutely agree. Great. So my next question is, in this age of advanced fraud detection technology, how important is the subject interview or interrogation?
I think it's as important, if not more important, than it's been in the past. But I'm not sure the emphasis is still put there. I just spoke to somebody last week, and I was talking to them about doing an interview class. And they said to me, I was talking about the importance for that communication, and the individual said to me, I really don't care what I get out of a subject interview. I have all the evidence. I have all the facts before I go in there. I just see that as an opportunity to give them a chance to say what they want to say. And I think that is such a misnomer, especially where a lot of us come from and the responsibility we have. Part of our mandate is to get at the whole picture and the whole story. And a lot of time, what we get from collecting evidence is not the whole story. Why did they do it? What internal control weaknesses did we have within the organization that allowed them to do it? The more we can understand their mindset and their what caused them and how they went about what they did, the more beneficial it is to us as an organization or us as an entity. So I think that interview is very important. But I find that there's more and more emphasis being put on some forensic techniques, on technology, on things like that cause us to focus on those and not really focus on the art of interviewing and the opportunity to sit down in the room. And I'm not sure why that's happening. I think it's a bad trend. And I think what you end up losing is a lot of talented interviewers in the course of that.
I think that is absolutely true. I think two things that come to mind for me is I always look for pain points, right? So you're interviewing and you're talking to somebody and you see a topic or something that you're talking about and they clearly start to shut down or there are changes in their baseline behavior. I make that little mental note, and then eventually I'll circle back around to that, and that is always that piece of that investigation that now I have new information. I go after that. I mean, you would never get that in just analyzing data or just looking at documents. You would never see that kind of thing.
That's absolutely right. You call it pain points. I call it their Achilles heel.
Yeah.
Those areas that we need to focus on. And we're not even going to see those things in that interview environment. I've had people say to me, well, this stuff is just common sense. It's just communications. And that's true, but we communicate as people not nearly as well as we used to. I think that the electronic age, texting, we're a snippet person, and what you're talking about is that ability you have, that inherent ability you have to pay attention to those details, to really active listen, to be able to use all your senses so that you see those pain points and you can come back to them. And I think those are missed a great deal when people are not focused nor have the confidence in the interviewing environment.
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I know that I have spent as much as upwards of an hour to set somebody up to get to that one question that I really want to know the answer to.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talk to people like that, everybody wants a quick fix, and we'll probably talk about quick fixes, but everybody wants that quick fix. And the fact is, I mean, it's a dance. It is like a play. You got to be prepared to stay there as long as you want. And they say, well, how long did these interviews take? I said, well, they take upwards 4, 5, 6 hours. And they look at you like, you're kidding me, because that's not how it's done on TV. I'm going to go and get the answer in 15 minutes. They're going to be willing to just hand it all over to me.
No,
just doesn't work that way.
You bring food in.
Yeah, no question. It's funny you say that, because I just wrote a blog yesterday on reciprocity. I love the subject of reciprocity. I talk about it all the time. Man, food can be your best tool, because you break bread with somebody, that person is more willing to share information with you.
Exactly. I mean, the airlines had it. They know that they were giving people food to calm them down on that flight. And so that absolutely applies to interviews and interrogations. But I did want to mention that the other thing that came to mind for me was that my biggest case that I ever identified and investigated myself was over 300 million euros. And the story is that I was there in that country doing a relatively small case, $175,000. And I was talking to this one guy, and it was about a 2-hour interview, and it was just information seeking. And at the end, I asked him, is there anything that keeps you up at night, anything that you feel like you want to tell me? And he took a long pause, and he's like, I have this one thing. And that question got me a 300 million euro case. And so I always ask that question now.
Alexis, that's exactly what we're talking about, because none of all the preparation, planning, and effort that you put into that $175,000 case, none of that would have gotten you the information you got from developing relationship and rapport in that interview and asking a question like that. That's why the audit or investigative interview in fraud cases is so important.
Absolutely. So on to the next question. What areas of emphasis are required in a fraud subject interview?
I think one of the things that I would emphasize in the fraud type interview is, we know that statistics support the fact that most of the individuals that we're talking to are subjects in these matters. This is their first time. Maybe it's not their first time doing something. It's their first time getting caught at doing it. We know the statistics are pretty high in that regard. We're not getting a lot of repeat offenders, although we get some. So when we deal with those individuals, we have to recognize that fear is paramount in that subject interview setting. Even if they're coming across arrogantly, even if they're coming across like they've got it all together, there is an element of fear there, because these individuals are often coming out of a white collar background, out of a background unfamiliar with the general criminal element. And these individuals are fearful of the consequences, whether they're fearful of going to jail, whether they're fearful of people finding out, whether they're fearful that they're going to have to go home and tell their wife and she's going to smack them over the head. Whatever the fear is, there's a fear issue there. When we see fear being there, one of the things we have to really focus on is the issue and element of rapport, and developing a rapport with that individual, finding those issues of commonality, finding those issues where we can agree on things in order to develop relationship and be able to get that person to start talking to us, building off of that commonality, finding those themes and rationalizations that we're going to use later on in the interview, and develop a little bit of trust. Because even in those situations, people say, well, you don't develop trust with the person. When we do things that are they like, we're almost back to the issue of reciprocity again from an emotional standpoint. Those individuals are going to respond to that in a positive way. So I think we really have to look at that when we're doing these interviews and work at developing that.
So it's interesting that you talk about fear. Not to get us off on a tangent, but do you think that with the limbic system and being able to only access certain memories because of that, and that fear plays a role in that, and what memories they can even access if they're so freaked out and so afraid, they get in that fight or flight, and now you're in the what you would call the lizard brain, right? So it actually affects what they can remember.
That's absolutely true. When that and as that fear grows, their ability to remember that stuff and generate it in a rational format as well. You know, we see that with in victimology with individuals that have been a victim of crime. There's not that linear thought process available, which allows them to tell the story in a rational manner. So as long as we can address that fear, minimize that fear, and they see us as the person who's doing that, we then have a better ability to access those additional memories and get them to tell the story in a fuller format. And they have to understand why that's a better thing to do, and we have to sell that to them as well.
Absolutely agree. So what would you say is the best theories and methods approach for a fraud interview? What is that?
Yeah, I get amazed. I guess I'm an individual practitioner here. I get amazed at some of the stuff I see out there in the interviewing landscape with regard to, I've got this product, I've got that product. We put different names on it. We turn it into a proprietary product. I think all those things really do a disservice to the investigative and audit community. We are always looking for that quick fix. Everybody's always looking for that pill that they can take and it solves everything. I don't think there's an interview pill out there yet, but we're looking for a process that's going to get us in and out of the room in the shortest amount of time with all the answers we're going to get. And anybody that sells that, individuals are trying to buy up and pick up on it. What I want people to understand that as interviewers, there really aren't a whole lot of different methods out there with regard to interviewing and interrogation. I think what we see is three primary methods. We have a direct method, the direct method being akin to the fact of you go in there and you tell them you know what they have, and then you know what they did, you have all the evidence, and then you kind of pound away at them with rationalizations, do a little bit of rapport, do the rationalizations, and just keep pounding at them to get them to admit to what they did. It's a direct technique. It has useful applications. There's no questions about it. I don't believe the applications are nearly as useful within the fraud and white-collar crime environment as they are maybe in some reactive crime cases and street crime cases. Then you have, excuse me.
Would that be the Reid Technique? Would you say that the Reid Technique is a direct method?
Yeah, I wasn't going to use names, but yes, I would say the Reid Technique. There's a few of them out there. Reid is one of them. If anybody's following what's going on with that, that's being challenged some places as being somewhat coercive and the like. Have I used that method before and been trained on it? Yes, I have. In the fraud and white-collar crime arena, I don't see the application. I see the application of some of the stuff they do. Behavioral analysis interviews, which is a proprietary term of theirs. Some of their rationalization and theme stuff is great stuff. But the whole issue of how think about it from the standpoint of the reciprocity issue. Reciprocity is a positive thing. If you're providing a positive position to the person you're talking to, they're more than likely to provide something positive back to you. But the antithesis of reciprocity works as well, which is if I'm jumping on you and yelling at you and screaming at you, why do we wonder that we get the same thing in return? We shouldn't. We're getting exactly what we're asking for. So that negative reciprocity, all that does, we just talked about fear, increases the fear, causes their ability to relate things to decrease, and then we wonder why we don't get the whole story, if any of the story. Or we wonder why we get a false admission, and we don't have good information to go with. So yes, that would be one application of what I call the direct method. And there's some other ones out there. The second one would be the story lock method. And I've certainly used story lock. Story lock is a great method to use, especially if you have records and documents that show what somebody did historically, where you lock them into a story. I've done it several times where I've been given a case and I looked at the allegation. I thought, man, why did my boss open this up? This is just ridiculous. But I thought I could catch them in a lie. So I would go in and speak to them and have them tell me the story of what took place, even if it was not true. And I just listen to it and encourage it and get them to tell me more and more, lock them into that story. On the federal side, I would get a signed sworn statement to that effect. And then I would go into the actual interview itself where I start developing how their story is not in line with the truth. And it's amazing the number of times you could get them to tell you the right story, because I found that people would rather appear stupid than appear as liars. So they would turn around and provide me the straight story. So that's the story lock method. And the final one is what we call the factual presentation method. It would be a non-confrontational technique. There's plenty of companies out there teaching that. Wicklander Zalowski, Don Rabin. It's taught by a bunch of different people. My problem with that is just when we make it a proprietary product that you can't use some of the same terms and all the rest. I understand it from a business standpoint. I don't understand it from a love of the art of interviewing. And so anything that I develop that's original, I'm never going to put a name on it, and anybody can use it they want, because that's what serves the people that are doing these interviews in the field. And so the factual presentation method, I think, is probably the most applicable to this fraud and interviewing environment, probably akin to a lot of the interviewing that you do, Alexis.
Mm-hmm. I think, I don't know, I'll date myself a little and say that I am quite fond of the Columbo approach of saying, I just don't understand. Could you help me understand this? And maybe because I'm a female, it works very well for me.
It's always worked for me as well. The only difference is you were acting and I probably wasn't.
I mean, you ask questions that you already know the answers to and things like that, but it seems just that approach of, really just help me understand. I'm just not getting it. That approach works well for me.
And it's a fantastic approach to use in the fraud environment. I used it a great deal in the when I was with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, because my understanding of electricity is if I plug something in, I hope it works. So it was very easy to go into nuclear power plants and say, hey, I don't understand how this LIPSI system works. You need to explain that to me and really draw it out for me. You can easily pull that out in a technical environment where you might not have that expertise, but you are watching them all the time to look for those nonverbal and verbal indicators of deception or evasiveness that we're always looking for in interviews. So it's a great way to do it.
Yeah, excellent. How important would you say that rapport is to the interview?
And we talked about this a little bit already. I think it's just extremely important in these type of interviews. I think that it is the whole basis of how we set up to get that person to tell us what they did. If we're not going to use rapport and develop some sort of relationship or commonality, or our first thought when we go into that interview is, hey, this guy's a jerk and I'm judging him and I'm applying all my biases and prejudices in this interview, we're not going to be able to get that person to tell us what they did. And if they do tell us something, the reason they're telling us something is under duress. It's amazing what type of relationship can be developed in a short period of time in an interview room. An example of that, a case that I looked at in a video study we did, and in looking at a lot of videos on interviewing and interrogation, came out of a homicide case. The individual that was being interviewed was the first 2 hours of the interview, the detective did rapport by himself. The guy wasn't talking at all. He managed through some different techniques to get him to start talking. The interview went on, I think, 5 or 6 hours. And at the end of that interview, the detective had an admission to the homicide that the individual was involved in. They went back and talked to this individual, the subject, who was incarcerated for life afterwards. And in talking to him, one of the things they asked him is, why did you tell him what you had done? And to me, his answer was extremely revealing. And it's the fun part of researching this stuff for me is hearing answers like this. This was his answer. Let me point out the detective was probably old enough to be this individual's father. He developed the themes along the lines of, hey, we're both dads, and we're both, we both live here, and we both do these things. So he established that commonality. But when they went in and asked this guy, why did you tell him what he did? This was his answer. His answer was, I felt like I would have disappointed him if I didn't tell him. And I went back in my mind to the last time I think I ever said that, and it was shortly after my mom died, back when I was 14 years old, and I was living, with just my dad and I. My dad was a tough guy. He was, hard to deal with. That was the last time I said that. And I know, looking at me, you think that was like only 10 years ago, but in fact, it was a lot longer ago. And I thought, what would cause this guy to say that? And essentially what he had done in that period of that 5 hours is create a relationship where the subject viewed the detective as someone like his dad. And so he just let it all out. That's the power of rapport in an interview setting.
Outstanding. How important is interviewing training for personnel in a company and its anti-fraud program?
I think it's immensely important. I think that's an awesome question because I don't see the emphasis being put in the area of interview training. I see the emphasis, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, on the newest, shiniest, brightest thing that shows up on the landscape, and we're going to dedicate all our money and send our people to this because it looks really cool and everybody will like it. Well, that's fine because there's some technology out there. There's things going on that need to be introduced into the investigation and audit climate, but there's nothing that's ever going to replace interviewing. We've seen this happen before. I go back historically in the country's history when we made the decision, we're not going to use human assets as much because human assets are dirty. Well, yeah, running informants and assets can be a very dirty process, but it's got that element, much like we talked about with getting the information from the subject, that can't be duplicated any other way. So we took away the emphasis on human assets and we decided satellites and technology was going to get us all the information. All we found out is that created a huge void of information in a lot of different places. We were concerned with things being dirty, so we want to go to a clean technique. It's like people saying to me, I got all the information, so I really don't care what the guy says in the interview room. Why do I have to get that? Well, the reason we have to get that is most of us are mandated to get the whole story. We are truth finders. So when I find the truth, I want to find the whole truth. Now, can we find the whole truth? Probably not. But I want to maximize the quality and quantity of information I get, because I don't want to have to go back in and investigate the same thing 6 months later, where we're seeing the same issues going on, because what we know is we have an internal control weakness. What we know is we have a recruiting weakness. Whatever it is, I want to find that stuff out. And the way we're going to do that is develop confident, quality interviewers within our team to be able to go in and get that information. That information also becomes much more relevant from the standpoint of administrative and criminal action against individuals. You can go in with all the evidence you want in the world, but I have not found a prosecutor or an administrative person handling a case that doesn't love a confession to what took place. So to me, on the federal side, man, I knew if I had that confession, there was a much higher probability that I was going to be able to prosecute that person than if I went in and said, well, you're going to have to convene a grand jury and call these 32 witnesses and do this and do that. Then the prosecutor's eyes are rolling back in his head, and he's saying, yeah, I don't know, maybe it's not that important. But you walk in with that signed statement, and he says, I'll take the case.
Absolutely. And, it comes to mind that I think that training inside an organization is also important because I have the perspective of I started out as a external consulting in public accounting doing the forensic investigations with them. And then I went in-house. And when I was in-house was really the first time that the relationship relationships were very, very important because, before as an external consultant, you swoop in, you do the investigation, you leave. You go on to the next company, the next industry, and you're only there during the investigation, you leave. So it becomes, I think, even more critical if you're an internal person having to do interviews and interrogations on the people that are in your same company, or at least if you're at the group level, the opcos underneath you, because you are going to continue to be working with these people. So I think that the training is even really more critical in those kinds of situations.
Absolutely, I fully agree with you, and that brings to thought two things: the issue of credibility and how important credibility is. If you're going to be there working with those people, and you're going to be a visible person within that organization, your credibility is of greatest essence there. When you look at research studies done, the number one reason people tell us what they did is because of the credibility of the interviewer. That they are what they say they are. And when you adopt that mindset and you're being credible across the board in the way you interact with others, there's an issue of respect that develops there. A lot of people have a hard time with that. Well, I have to work with these people. How am I going to ask them the tough question? You're going to ask them the tough question because you do work with them. And because each individual that you're working with there has the same expectation of how they're going to be treated within the organization. I worked for a period of time when I was up in the state of New York. I worked as a Deputy Inspector General in the Division of Military and Naval Affairs. It's a state agency that oversees the National Guard. And I worked directly for a major general there who was a great guy to work with. But man, when it came down to handing him investigative results and said, you need to, take action in this case, he had such a hard time pulling the trigger on those things. And I had to say to him, man, you're representing 25,000 soldiers in the state. You have the onus is on you to take appropriate action here and tell everybody else this is what needed to be done. If you want to have a bake sale for the guy after you fire him, have the bake sale. But do the right thing first, and then go on and do that. That's that credibility that's going to be seen across the organization, and people are going to appreciate that. So that was the one comment. The other one I wanted to ask you, working in an organization like that, and I assume you worked with other individuals that were doing the same thing, did you see an inconsistency in the work product of the different people you work with?
Oh, sure. I mean, it depended on their level of skill, their level of training, where they were, what areas they were responsible for.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the things, and sometimes, there's going to be a difference because we're all unique individuals. But we need to be in organizations, especially where you have several individuals doing investigation. We need to be consistent in our approach. We need to be consistent in the expectation of what we should get from these interviews. Because I'm sure in that organization, as well as most of the ones we work for, there is that mandate to get at the whole picture here. And if we're all doing that, we're going to do a better job at getting rid of some of these systemic deficiencies that continue to plague organizations and cause us to have to keep going back and going back and going back and looking at the same things. Would you agree that that would be a helpful thing to do?
Oh, absolutely. And if you think forward, while you're doing an investigation, whether, let's say, an internal management has the ultimate decision whether they prosecute or not, whether they go forward with that. So I always do the investigation with the idea that it will end up in court no matter what, so that they have that option should they choose to do that. And, thinking forward, if you have inconsistencies in your process, opposing counsel is going to eat you for breakfast.
Oh, absolutely.
You absolutely have to be consistent, and it has to be the same for every single investigation, whether I'm there or somebody else or somebody on my team is doing it. It has to be consistent.
And that's it. We're back to the issue of credibility because there's a certain amount of that we can't control at all.
Sure.
The number of times I've been in a situation of, hey, well, this guy did this. We really he needs to be fired. And I said, well, what did you do in the last 10 cases of this? Exactly. Oh, well, we gave him 2 weeks off. We made him stay home at lunch. Some stupid sort of response to that. But in this case, we don't like this guy, so we're going to get rid of him. Some of that we can't control, but our credibility is going to cause us to be very honest and open about what we did, because we are fact finders. We aren't the judge and jury in these cases, and we'd only have to justify our actions and the fact that we approach things consistency, hence why we have the all the direction and guidance and employee misconduct cases and things like that.
Absolutely. Do you have any other last thoughts for us before we go today?
Wait a minute. Is that where you get me to make the admission to the €3 million thing?
Is there anything that's bothering you that keeps you up at night?
There's lots of things that are bothering me, but I don't think it's in the context of this. No, I can't think of anything else. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. And I hope this is useful to some of the people that follow what you do, and I certainly appreciate following what you do. So I thank you for the opportunity.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for being a fraud fighter and for making a difference.